The United States Pledge of Allegiance ends with the words liberty and justice for all. The current US president has deported hundreds of people quickly without trial.
I will invoke the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. You know, 1798. That's when they ran the country a little tougher than we run it today.
That law, still in effect more than 2 centuries later, allows U.S. authorities to arrest and deport immigrants who are over 14 years old, even if they've not been charged with a crime. It was enacted to prevent foreign espionage and sabotage, and until 2025 had only been applied in times of war. In 1812, against the British Empire and against citizens of enemy countries during both world wars. Between 1942 and 1946, the Alien Enemies Act, together with an executive order, allowed U.S. authorities to imprison about 120,000 U.S. residents of Japanese descent in internment camps, just because of their origins. 2/3 of them were American citizens.
This constitutes one of the greatest human rights violations in the United States. What's more, the government has historically apologized to people of Japanese descent for committing such an offense.
That was the last time the Alien Enemies Act was used, until Trump. The Due Process Clause, found in 2 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, ensures that no person, including immigrants, can be detained without a fair legal process. The president can only override that clause and invoke the Alien Enemies Act without congressional approval during an enemy invasion. Many believe that's why Trump calls migrants invaders.
I think the chances of a mass deportation of 12 million immigrants are very low. But what we've seen in the past under President Trump's previous administration is that there have been raids on workplaces and hospitals. We've seen a pattern where fear has been created and people who are not high priority have been deported. For example, people without criminal charges, people who are studying or have jobs, who have families, and who have lived in the United States for many years.
Rights groups and activists accuse the Trump administration of racial discrimination in its deportations. Officially, under U.S. law, all people are meant to be treated equally, but in practice, different groups have always been treated unequally under the law, since the nation's founding.
People of color were not considered human beings, nor were women.
The United States Declaration of Independence, 1776, states that all men are created equal. This declaration was written by Thomas Jefferson, who at the same time, throughout his life, owned about 600 slaves.
Here, man refers to human beings. The problem is understanding what Jefferson and the Founding Fathers mean by human beings. Not the Native Americans, not the black people, not the Spaniards, only the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. That's the big difference with Spain's colonization of America, which, despite all its flaws, at least considered everyone a person. The Native American is a person, the same as me. But the U.S. government, even in the 19th century, paid $12 for every Native American scalp that a citizen turned in. We're talking about a government that, in the 19th century, was paying its citizens to murder indigenous people.
In the 17th century, a group of Christians called the Puritans came to North America, primarily from England. They believed they were a chosen people. Their objective was to create a virtuous society that would serve as a model to save humanity. But in the 18th century, those ideas got mixed up with pseudoscientific racist beliefs.
It's their we approach. This combination here, man, white, Anglo-Saxon, and Calvinist, we are the only ones who have a true covenant with God.
They considered that the American branch of a supposed Anglo-Saxon race would be the pinnacle of absolute perfection, and would also be the race with the greatest desire for freedom and for protecting individual rights. And the rest of the races that are inferior would only have 2 options: either submit, in this case it would be the supposed black race, or be replaced, as in the case case of Native Americans.
The United States wanted to expand what Thomas Jefferson, its third president, called the Empire of Liberty.
By 1803, Thomas Jefferson was writing a letter to Washington in which he said something like, although our present interests restrict us to our present limits, it's impossible not to foresee what will happen when our rapid multiplication leads us to cover the entire continent. And he ends by saying our confederation should be seen as the nest from which all of America, both North and South, should be populated. So he's making it clear that since 1803, we're going to keep everything, which means taking whatever we need to take, which obviously means killing whoever we have to kill.
The founders of the United States believed they were chosen by God, and that belief helped justify their expansion across North America. In 1783, the independence that the 13 British colonies in North America had declared 7 years earlier was officially recognized. From very early on, there was the idea that indigenous peoples should be assimilated. Native Americans were expected to adopt the white settlers' way of life. However, the prevailing view, driven by figures like President Thomas Jefferson, was that the natives were incompatible with white civilization. They believed that Native Americans should be expelled so white settlers could use their lands. It was Jefferson who, in 1803, finalized the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France for $15 million. The Louisiana Territory made up 23% of the current United States. And actually, France didn't even control most of it. The US was basically buying the right to conquer Native American lands without another European power standing in its way. For Native Americans, it meant more hunger, massacres, and plundering of their land. Many were forced to live on reservations designated by the US government, where they struggled to survive. After the Louisiana Purchase, the United States acquired Florida from Spain, which had been weakened by its war against France, and was struggling to hold on to its colonies. In 1821, King Ferdinand VII ceded Florida to the US in exchange for $5 million, a sum he never actually received. Instead, the United States used that money to settle financial claims made by American citizens against the Spanish government. The transfer of Florida opened the door to the persecution of the indigenous Seminole people. Before that, the Seminoles were considered subjects of the Spanish Empire, which had given them a certain level of protection. But with Florida in US hands, the Seminoles were persecuted and forced off their lands. In 1846, the US and Britain agreed on a border for the Oregon Territory, paving the way for American expansion to the Northwest. A year earlier, newspaper articles featured the first written mentions of what they called manifest destiny. Now, a name was coined for the dominant ideology in the 19th century United States. The right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given for us the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. It is a right such as that of the tree to the space of air and earth suitable for the full expansion of its principle and destiny of growth. Those words were published when the United States was looking not only westward, but also to the south. As early as 1823, President James Monroe had formulated what would become the country's long-term foreign policy, known since then as the Monroe Doctrine. His strategy rejected the presence of European countries throughout the continent and sought to consolidate the United States' position as the new dominant power in the region.
This defensive warning, in principle, would serve to convince the United States throughout the 19th century that all of the Americas was its exclusive zone of influence.
What he mainly did was give the U.S. a free hand to intervene in the affairs of Latin American countries.
In the early 19th century, Texas was a part of Mexico, and Mexico gave permission to about 30,000 Anglo-Americans to settle there. But those settlers didn't respect local laws. For instance, they refused to give up on slavery, even though Mexico had outlawed it. The conflict between Mexican authorities and American settlers eventually led to a war that ended with Texas unilaterally declaring independence.
Of course, the U.S. military supports the Texans gaining independence from Mexico, and you have this independent Texas from 1836 to 1845. That's why when the U.S. annexed Texas, for the U.S., which recognized Texan independence, it was allowing an independent country to join the Union. But for Mexico, which did not recognize Texan independence, the U.S. was invading Mexican territory.
Just 1 year after the U.S. annexed Texas, Mexico's border troubles continued. The United States took advantage of the Mexican government's weakness to declare war. That ended 2 years later with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The United States took possession of what are today the states of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. A huge area with traditionally very low population density.
But it was also a territory that Mexico had only sparsely populated. From Texas to California, there were only about 70,000 inhabitants, mostly indigenous communities, Spanish friars, and the occasional landowner. So the argument was the same. You are not exploiting this territory, therefore God wants it to be mine.
After the 1848 defeat, Mexico gave up more territory voluntarily. The sale of La Mesilla, or the Gadsden Purchase, in 1853. The Mexican government's decision was undoubtedly driven by the desire to avoid another war with its powerful northern neighbor.
It's not as if Mexico had a choice. In the mid-19th century, Mexico couldn't impose any kind of condition on the U.S., just as it can't today.
In the mid-19th century, U.S. leaders believed they not only had the right to intervene in Mexico, but also the duty to do so. This was reflected in an article published in 1846 in an American magazine, the American Whig Review, cited in the book Race and Manifest Destiny. Mexico was poor, distracted, in anarchy, and almost in ruins. What could she do to stay the hand of our power, to impede the march of our greatness? We are Anglo-Saxon Americans. It was our destiny to possess and rule this continent. We were bound to it. We were a chosen people, and this was our allotted inheritance, and we must drive out all other nations before us. In the years following the Gadsden Purchase, the United States would reach its current borders with the purchase of Alaska from the Russian Empire in 1867 and the annexation of Hawaii in 1898. From then on, the U.S. stopped adding new land, for the most part. Instead, it focused on growing its power through economic influence and politics. In practice, this meant that the United States gave itself permission to do as it wished throughout the Americas, although it almost always preferred not to annex the territories it intervened in. The first example of the U.S.'s new ambitions is the war against Spain. In 1848, Washington had made an offer to buy the island of Cuba for $100 million. But Spain rejected the offer. In 1898, the United States took advantage of the mysterious explosion of a U.S. battleship in the port of Havana to blame Madrid and declare war. The conflict ended with a clear U.S. victory, which forced Spain to relinquish its claim to Cuba and cede Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. The U.S. annexed Puerto Rico and Guam as territories, but in the Philippines they faced fierce resistance from Filipino nationalists, leading to a long, brutal guerrilla war. As for Cuba, it became independent of Spain and the U.S. But under a treaty signed with Havana in 1903, Washington secured the perpetual use of the Guantanamo Bay area and formalized its right to intervene in Cuban affairs whenever it wanted. By then, the old idea of manifest destiny had evolved. While the United States still prioritized its national interests, it also saw itself as a model republic, a beacon of liberty. With this new role, the U.S. believed it had a duty to spread good governance and democracy around the world, by any means necessary. In 1913, the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, Walter Hines Page, and the British Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, had a revealing conversation about a coup that had just occurred in Mexico.
Suppose you have to intervene. What then?
Make them vote and live by their decisions.
But suppose they will not so live?
We'll go in and make them vote again.
And keep this up 200 years?
Yes, the United States will be here for 200 years, and it can continue to shoot men for that little space till they learn to vote and rule themselves.
The 20th century began in the United States with the vast majority of white Americans still convinced they were the people destined to bring good governance, commercial prosperity, and Christianity to the rest of the world.
Let's talk about occupations in Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Between 1912 and 1924, what the U.S. did was occupy them for years, administer the entire state, and even create their armed forces according to the U.S. model. This affected the democratic development of those countries and created second-class citizens. That is, lawyers and professors were left almost without work. This first generated revolutions and then a very strong rejection and anti-Americanism.
But with wars raging in Europe, Latin America became a secondary concern for the United States. Already before World War II, Washington considered that the ambitions of Germany and Japan could threaten its survival. So from the beginning of the war, it provided essential support to the Allies.
When Hitler invaded Poland in 1939, the U.S. began to prepare.
It is rightly stated that the sacrifice of 20 million people by the Soviet Union was essential to defeating Nazi Germany. And of course, that is undeniable. But it is also true that without US money and factories, Allied victory in World War II would have been impossible. The United States lent the Soviet Union a large amount of food and oil. And also for the United Kingdom, tens of thousands of trucks, locomotives, or wagons, a whole series of items and products that, while not directly for military use, were essential and fundamental to maintain the war effort.
The U.S. landing in Normandy was also key to the survival of Western Europe.
The conquests by the Allies from France and Normandy prevented the Soviet army from occupying all of Europe, and therefore prevented all of Europe from falling into Stalin's hands. This meant that the countries of Western Europe did not suffer the fate of those in Eastern Europe. That is, dictatorships where any opposition was eradicated and opponents were imprisoned, and where every time there was any kind of uprising or revolt against the governments, the Soviet Union would intervene militarily with its tanks.
There's also post-war support, which is the entire reconstruction of Europe through the Marshall Plan. If the U.S. hadn't entered, if this plan had not existed, surely or possibly they would have been more at the mercy of the Nazis. Or, if the Soviet Union had won, it would have taken much longer, and they would have been more exposed to the ideological influence, control, and the type of government that the Soviet Union had at the time. Without the Normandy landing or U.S. participation, it would have been difficult for Europe to defeat Hitler, although Hitler himself made the mistake of invading the Soviet Union. And I think with that, Hitler would have been defeated. Maybe the Soviets would have taken the rest of Europe, we'll never know. But it's the U.S. that cannot allow that project to reach the Atlantic coast.
The U.S. intervention in World War II freed Western Europe from Hitler and from the possibility of later being ruled by Stalin. That and the $13 billion of the Marshall Plan to rebuild the continent forged a strong alliance between Washington and the countries west of the Iron Curtain. But the United States also ended the war by carrying out what many consider one of the most devastating acts of war in human history, dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Very likely, the desire to demonstrate the United States' destructive capability to the Soviet Union played a very important role in the decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It seems there was an interest on the part of Truman's cabinet in dropping the atomic bombs. First, to test them, and second, above all, to send a message to the Soviet Union so that Washington could more easily impose its perspectives and interests in the post-war world.
The atomic bomb was a signal to the Soviet Union that the U.S. saw itself as a global power, which the Soviet Union did too.
In the second half of the 20th century, the United States, which still saw itself as a beacon of freedom, identified communism as the greatest threat to liberal democracies. To stop it, the US didn't hesitate to back dictatorships and use force to protect its influence and to contain Soviet expansion.
Communism had to be contained on all fronts wherever possible.
The first major challenge to the containment policy was Korea. What had been a Japanese colony since 1910 was divided into two states after World War II. North of the 38th parallel was the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a communist dictatorship. And to the south was the Republic of Korea, a capitalist dictatorship. North Korea didn't accept the partition of the country, and so without warning, in June 1950, it invaded the south. The Communist Army, better equipped, quickly overcame the South Korean troops and the few US units stationed there, conquering almost the entire peninsula. After the initial surprise attack, the US quickly gathered enough troops to stop North Korea's advance. Leading a coalition of 16 countries, it pushed back and nearly took control of all of North Korea, reaching close to the Chinese border. But Mao's communist China wasn't willing to let US forces so close. On October 19, 1950, China entered the war. Outnumbering their enemies, they were able to force the US coalition to retreat. The fighting eventually reached a stalemate, with neither side able to secure a decisive victory. In 1953, both sides agreed to an armistice, but since no final peace treaty was signed, the war technically never ended. 10 years after the Korean War began, a similar conflict erupted in Vietnam. The North was a communist state, while the South was a capitalist dictatorship, supported by Washington with money and military aid. However, the South's government was corrupt and struggled to control the Viet Cong guerrillas, who were backed by the North and aimed to reunify the country under communism. To prevent this, the US kept sending more military advisors, and by 1964 decided to intervene directly in the war.
The paradox is that from very early on, there was already a conviction in the White House that this was a war that could not be won. Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of Defense from 1961 to 1968, was soon saying directly that this war could not be won. Yet by the late 1960s, there were nearly 500,000 US soldiers in Vietnam.
That investment of ever-increasing resources and soldiers generated protests that put the US government in a bind.
Young Americans didn't understand why they had to march off to a war thousands of kilometers away and die in a jungle to defend their country. This led US administrations, especially from Nixon onward, to look for a way to exit Vietnam in a minimally honorable way that didn't appear to be a defeat. The solution Nixon found was a play on words called the Vietnamization of the conflict, which meant that the United States would withdraw. And all the United States would do from then on was finance the entire military effort of South Vietnam, spending millions on weapons and more weapons and more weapons, and tanks and planes for South Vietnam. The problem was that the South Vietnamese regime was so ineffective, had so little support amongst its own population, and was so corrupt that it was useless. And in the end, it fell to North Vietnam, creating the image the United States didn't want, that of defeat, even though the United States was technically no longer at war with North Vietnam.
The same goal of stopping communism that led the United States to intervene in Asia soon brought US leaders' attention back to Latin America. After the Cuban Revolution of 1958, the CIA sounded the alarm.
It was pointed out that communism was no longer coming from outside, but would end up within the countries of Latin America themselves if certain economic problems were not solved. So Kennedy's foreign policy combined diplomacy with military assistance, and this meant that under certain conditions, Latin American countries would receive economic aid.
The U.S. aimed to unite all of the Americas against the spread of communism from Cuba. In 1961, seeking support from the Organization of American States to replace Fidel Castro with a provisional government, the U.S. planned the invasion of Playa Girón, better known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The operation, carried out by Cuban exiles trained and armed by Washington, failed in just 5 days. More than 100 soldiers were killed and over 1,000 captured. The next year, the U.S. discovered Soviet nuclear missile bases in Cuba, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis, the tensest moment of the Cold War. For 13 days in October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. Fortunately, negotiations prevented disaster. Moscow agreed to dismantle and remove the missiles, and in return, the U.S. withdrew its nuclear weapons from Turkey, ending the crisis.
At this point, the U.S., a bit paranoid due to the missile crisis and the Bay of Pigs fiasco, decided to invade the Dominican Republic. And concerning this invasion, some authors say, and I have been able to verify, that the communist threat of what was happening in the Dominican Republic was exaggerated.
The United States will have no problem renouncing the issue of democracy, in particular if it believes that a dictatorial regime is much more suitable and can more easily prevent the expansion of communism anywhere in the world.
In the next decade, the United States financed movements in Chile to destabilize the socialist government. It culminated in a military coup that overthrew the elected president, Salvador Allende. Although the United States helped create the conditions for the uprising, today Washington's role in bringing dictator Augusto Pinochet to power is considered much less significant than previously thought.
As more documents are declassified, a new interpretation is emerging. They have concluded that Chile's political fate was going to happen anyway, with more or less dollars from Washington or with more or less support from Moscow.
Following the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States became the world's only superpower. The country interpreted its triumph in the Cold War as proof that it was a model of freedom and good government. It took on the task of spreading its ideals around the world, and it used its power to act as the world's policeman. But those ideals also got mixed up with its own political and economic interests. After almost unconditional support from Western Europe since World War II, allies like France and Germany began to distrust American intentions in the Middle East in its responses to the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001.
This was an iconic moment for foreign policy entering the 21st century in terms of returning to old practices, that is, carrying out unilateral operations under unproven pretexts.
The problem with the U.S. intervention in Iraq during the Second Gulf War was that it was highly controversial from the outset, because the reasons presented for the intervention, one was that Saddam Hussein's regime had weapons of mass destruction, and another that his regime had participated in the September 11 attacks, turned out to be false. Even before the invasion itself, there was a disagreement between the United States and traditional allies such as France and Germany, who refused to support this intervention. Furthermore, the fact that the United States acted in this way, regardless of any United Nations resolution, and according to its own geostrategic interests to control an area of enormous oil resources, made the United States appear merely as an imperialist power. And all the talk about Iraqi freedom and democracy was simply seen as hypocritical pretexts.
Other events further eroded global trust. images of US soldiers abusing detainees at Iraq's Abu Ghraib prison, and the prolonged pre-trial detention of terrorism suspects at Guantanamo Bay. These incidents cast doubt on America's long-standing self-image as a champion of freedom and human rights. By the early 21st century, many of its allies were no longer persuaded by that narrative.
The Americans went to give democracy to the Koreans, the Vietnamese, the Afghans, the Iraqis, the Libyans, the Syrians, and in every place where the U.S. gives democracy, what eventually emerges is a dictatorship.
Richard Haass, a longtime advisor to several U.S. presidents from Jimmy Carter to George W. Bush, issued a mea culpa in an interview with the German weekly Der Spiegel. We knowingly created weak states in the Middle East that collapsed before our eyes. The war in Iraq is also a reason why many Americans no longer want us to get involved far away abroad. Our difficulty in finding the right balance has contributed to the instability of the world. We should neither overdo it nor be too reserved. We should refrain from democratic proselytizing in other countries. The goal of American foreign policy should be to help shape the foreign policy of others. Policy change, not regime change. Today, Washington is facing another rising superpower. China now feels confident enough to openly challenge US dominance. At the same time, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the exposure of NATO's eastern flank have pushed European allies to once again lean on the US for support. But the United States that once helped liberate Europe from Hitler and stood firm against Stalin is not the same country today.
Today, the U.S. lacks the physical, political, or economic capacity. And now let's add the demographic weight to interact or sustain different fronts simultaneously. The diplomacy first policy says the U.S. is nothing without its allies. And it's impossible to respond to the threats in the Middle East, to the threats specifically posed by Russia, China, and North Korea. It's impossible without its allies and partners.
But Donald Trump has another vision.
That's going to change everything. You know, Trump doesn't like allies. He doesn't want to have to support allies. He doesn't like Ukraine. I think he's going to try to get a peace deal with Putin at the expense of Ukraine. That's going to set a very bad precedent for the rest of Europe. I think that in the Far East, it's not clear that he would be willing to actually defend American allies against China. So these are really major geopolitical risks that I think we're entering into right now.
This is how the dynamics of world powers work. There is always a dominant power, and there are always emerging powers. Emerging powers seek to become dominant, and eventually the emerging power, one way or another, will have to fight the dominant power and take its place.
The United States has always considered and presented itself as the custodian of the essence of democracy and freedom. It remains to be seen if it can continue to play this role in the future.
Whatever the next US administration's policies, Washington's allies are starting to see the US as an unpredictable partner. For Western Europe, that means it no longer has a choice but to guarantee its own defense.